Welcome back to A More Perfect Union, the Hill's 3-day virtual festival. We're going to bring this year's festival to a close over the next hour, and boy, do we have a terrific lineup of speakers for you. We're going to talk health, and we're going to talk education. And as President Biden heads to Europe for meetings with world leaders, we're going to examine the state of U.S. foreign policy. Before we get underway, a reminder. You can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag #TheHillAMPU, The Hill, A More Perfect Union. We're broadcasting live, and we'll be taking your questions, and if you experience any trouble with your live stream, just refresh the page. I'm told it will fix everything. My first guest epitomizes leadership as he continues to give all Americans a crash course in epidemiology. For almost 4 decades, he's been the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. He's become somewhat of a celebrity during the Trump administration with his candid scientific answers about the coronavirus. He's now also President Biden's chief medical advisor and shows no signs of slowing down. Dr. Anthony Fauci, it's a real honor, as always, to have you. I know that you're one of the busiest people in the world. As I look at this, and we are talking about a more perfect union, what that entails, what's a healthier nation. But I also know this is a global challenge, and this divide of, this story of 2 COVID stories, if you will, of those that are taking the virus seriously, getting vaccinated, preparing for boosters, wearing masks, washing hands. That's part of the country. Another part is not doing that. And this is reflected in a lot of nations around the world. And I guess my question to you is, how worried are you that we're going to have large populations that continue to resist kind of coming across that line and understanding that this is really deadly serious?
Well, that's a very important question that you asked, Steve. That is quite concerning. When you have a global pandemic, it has to be a uniform global response. And when you have an outbreak in a country, an epidemic, in order to effectively control it and keep your citizens safe, you have to have a very well orchestrated and implemented public health plan. And when you, as you have just said correctly, we unfortunately have a degree of divisiveness in society where fundamental public health principles that have been established for a very long period of time, the importance of vaccinations, the importance of public health measures of mitigation, when they are outright rejected by certain elements in society, that makes the entire effort less effective. So if we really want to end this and get back to, as you say, a more perfect union, we have to pull together and realize that the common enemy is the virus. And when you have a common enemy, everybody's got to pull together, metaphorically, almost as if you were in a war where it's no time to be at odds with each other. We have a very common enemy that's trying to do us in. So I would hope that as time goes by, we do better in synergizing with each other to control this, as opposed to having opposition to fundamental public health principles.
Let me ask you about this next phase that we're entering. And I guess there are 2 parts to it. As I understand, I would love to understand from you what the latest is, but on boosters, first of all, with various of the options for Americans like Johnson & Johnson and Moderna and Pfizer. And so trying to upgrade our antibodies with booster shots and bring that on, but also the vaccination of children. And what I'm interested in really is not just what the data says on what can be done, but have we learned anything from the rollout of what we had a year ago with vaccinations that helps us reach a lot of America that is underserved? We know this virus hit communities disproportionately. Are there things that we learned in the rollout that we can now apply as we roll out boosters and we roll out vaccinations to children that can help make this a smoother and more inclusive situation than we had over the last year?
Yeah, I can think of 2 very important things, Steve, that can be done. One is to make sure that you engage trusted messengers that people in society trust and will listen to when they hear recommendations, for example, to get vaccinated in the first place, or to get a booster once you've gotten your primary regimen that's been administered, as well as why it's so important to get children vaccinated, even though children, from the standpoint of statistics, don't get as nearly much of a severe involvement with the infection as elderly or people with underlying conditions. Nonetheless, a considerable number of children do get into serious difficulty when they get infected, as we know from merely looking at some of the pediatric hospitals throughout the country. So first is trusted messengers. That could be a clergy person, that could be your family pediatrician, that could be anyone that you have respect for and will listen to. The next is to make it extremely convenient and easy and very, very clear about how people can either get vaccinated in the primary sense, but also the availability of the booster shots. For example, we've recently had the FDA give an authorization and the CDC give recommendations for boosters for the three products that we have, the mRNA of Pfizer and Moderna and the J&J product. So the recommendations and the guidelines have to be very clear so that there's no confusion. And the CDC is trying to do that by making their recommendations on their website very, very clear for anyone who just clicks in to take a look at that, but also to make it very convenient. A good example of that, Steve, is that we would like to see as many children age 5 to 11 get vaccinated. So what we've done preemptively is to mobilize and get the doses in the right formulation for the children, because it's a different formulation. It's not 30 micrograms for Pfizer BioNTech. It's a third of that. It's 10 micrograms. So to get that ready in pharmacies, in pediatric offices, in pediatric hospitals, and in community centers, so that when parents decide that they do want to get their children vaccinated, it will be very easy and convenient to do so. So we've learned those two lessons from the original rollout of the vaccine program many months ago.
Great. You and I have talked about these issues in public health so many times. And I guess, as Tom Bossert, who is President Trump's former Homeland Security advisor, who said that we were really failing on testing. He said we're focused on testing the ill. We need to test the well. If you go to Paris today, as I did recently, in Paris, you can be tested anywhere for free immediately as a citizen of Paris and get the result within 15 minutes on your phone. And if I need a test tomorrow, as I do, I can call Same Day Health in Georgetown, pay my insurance, a $75 thing on top. It's prohibitive in many parts of the country, and access, even if it is free, is fairly limited. I also, interviewed Dr. Redfield a while back on contact tracing, and so I wonder if if someone is identified with COVID, are we still doing contact tracing? He told me we were going to hire 60,000 people in contact tracing. So I guess I'm interested in where is our public health infrastructure on those fronts, and should we be doing more than we are, not just for today, but setting ourselves up for stuff that comes down the pike tomorrow?
Well, let's take testing, for example. You make a very, very good point. We right now are markedly accelerating the availability of free testing. For example, there's been now a couple of $1 billion investment in getting to the point where we can actually have available 200 million tests per month available in exactly the same situation that you said, where you will be able to do here what you were able to do in Paris, namely very quickly and easily get a test that, for the most part, in most cases, not always, but in most cases, could be free. So we really have to do that. But we did not have easy availability of testing a while ago, but it's rapidly improving. And then when you have that, then the issue of identification, isolation, and contact tracing fits right into line with that. So your point is very well taken, and I believe that soon you're going to see a much greater availability of easy testing.
Look, I have to ask you this question in front of our audience, which in thinking about a more perfect union, which is also to think about disaster. And folks, I'll tell you, I've asked Tony Fauci before about what keeps him up at night, what he's really worried about. And guess what? Before COVID came along, he described really most of the characteristics of COVID. I want to share our audience that Dr. Fauci has worked on Ebola, Zika, N1H1, HIV/AIDS, respiratory infections, diarrheal diseases, tuberculosis, malaria, saved millions, tens of millions, perhaps hundreds of millions of lives in HIV/AIDS, and so many other areas of epidemiological science. And I guess my question to you is, I want our audience to get an understand of what the front line of science is doing and what you worry about coming that we need to prepare for. Because we talk a lot about reacting to COVID. I think that the other bigger underlying part is science and what we're thinking about. What's the comet coming at us that's micro level that we need to really be thinking about?
A great question, Steve, and that's something that we take very seriously and are acting on. I think a good example of how fundamental investment in basic and clinical research allowed us to do something unprecedented when it came to COVID-19. And you know the story. It was the development of a vaccine that we first recognized its appearance and its genomic sequence in the first week of January of 2020. And less than 12 months later, 11 months later, we had a highly effective vaccine that was safe, going into the arms of people, saving millions of lives. When you talk about pandemic preparedness for the future, it's got to be a combination of both public health preparedness at the domestic and global level, as well as the very successful scientific preparedness that we experienced with COVID-19. And it's going to take an investment that's just not a couple of $1 billion. It's going to be a plan that we put forth that would require over a 10-year period at least $65 billion of investment, of getting interaction and transparency among nations to get a strategic network of countries and individuals who can respond literally immediately to an outbreak, so that we can get vaccines available and made in 100 days and distributed in very shortly thereafter. That's what we have to have ready for the next outbreak. And that's something that we're putting plans. You know, there's a thing, Steve, called prototype pathogen approach, where rather than waiting for an outbreak from a pathogen of a particular family, you do some fundamental core research, for example, on all coronaviruses, or all alpha viruses, or all arenaviruses, so that when you do get an outbreak with any of those families, you'll have enough core information, like a phase 1 study of a vaccine that's ready to roll out as soon as you notice you're having an outbreak. All of those things are in play right now to prepare for what will inevitably happen, and that is another pandemic.
Can I just ask you real quickly, one quick question, Tony, is if we do this interview 10 years from now, given all that you've invested in mRNA research, I'd just like to know, just speculating, and I know you don't like to speculate, but I'm going to ask you to speculate, what are some of the other diseases that we will have taken a chunk out of and perhaps rolled back that you hope, given some of the base of research in mRNA, which has enabled us to have a chance at COVID, but what are some of the other things out there mRNA might help us with?
Well, you're speaking in a very prescient way, Steve, because that's already happening in that people involved with other diseases in which it's been problematic with vaccines are already utilizing the mRNA technology. We know that for HIV, already companies and even our own group here at NIH are doing that. Also malaria, also tuberculosis, and even interestingly, outside of the realm of infectious diseases, also immunizations and vaccinations against certain cancers in immunotherapy. So the mRNA technology was really a transforming advance in vaccinology that I believe 10 years from now, Steve, if we have this conversation, we're going to be talking about a number of successful vaccines that have emanated out of the extraordinary success of the COVID-19 vaccines.
Well, Dr. Anthony Fauci, Director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, it's always an honor to talk to you. Thank you for all that you've done on the front of COVID and so many of these other ailments that have hit the human race. And we look forward to talking to you again. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Steve. I very appreciate your having me. Thank you.
My next guest is a practicing emergency room physician, former health commissioner of Baltimore, and a professor of health policy and management at George Washington University. She's also author of a recent book, and I've read this book. I really recommend everyone read this book, Lifelines, A Doctor's Journey in the Fight for Public Health. Dr. Leana Wen, thank you so much for joining us. I just want to start out with the news. I mean, where are we with children and COVID? You know, you've been writing about, the different phases of how our society needs to take health seriously, health guidelines seriously. What are the health guidelines as you see it regarding children right now?
Well, I think there is one pervasive and false narrative that we really have to counter, which is that children somehow do not get sick from COVID-19. That's just not true. I mean, when we look at this group of kids that we're now getting the vaccines authorized for, this group that's 5 to 11 years old, there have been more than 1.9 million cases of COVID infections in this group. More than 8,600 of these younger kids have been hospitalized. Thousands have had this multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children. And by the way, about a third of the kids who've been hospitalized are children who are previously healthy, who don't have underlying medical conditions. And tragically, 143 of these younger kids have died. And so I think it's really fantastic news that we could have a vaccine for this younger group on the horizon. I can tell you, as a mom of 2 little kids, although my little kids are too young to be in this 5 to 11-year-old group, I have a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old. My husband and I are living with a lot of caution because we're worried about our children. And we really cannot wait until our kids are also able to be vaccinated so that we parents and certainly children can regain some sense of normalcy too.
Well, look, I just want to underscore what Dr. Wen just shared, and Dr. Wen in her Twitter feed did share these statistics, and among them, the most sobering was that 143 5 to 11-year-olds have actually died. And I can't tell you the number of times I have heard in the hallways from people, even from informed experts, oh, children are not vulnerable. But that's absolutely not true, and you can see it in these numbers. But let me just kind of go a step further as we sort of talk about this moment we're in, which is not over, but how we use this moment to reestablish our connection to smarter public health. You and I talked at the beginning of this pandemic and said we have not been smart about that scaffolding of public health. What do you think we're doing? What do you think we're not yet taking seriously enough?
Steve, I am really worried about where we are when it comes to public health. Prior to COVID-19, I thought that the biggest challenge we would have is to get people to recognize the importance of prevention, the importance of having local and state public health infrastructure and the work that we do all the time around the opioid epidemic, around other infectious diseases, around caring for our most vulnerable. But unfortunately, during COVID, we have seen public health becoming politicized and basic measures like masking or vaccines or testing being put into the middle of ideological culture wars. The New York Times just did an analysis that found that there have been more than 100 laws that have been passed in state legislatures to directly restrict public health authority. That doesn't just affect COVID. That means that in the future, if there is a case of multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, a local health authority may no longer be able to apply quarantine. And that means that if we have another virus that requires masking, maybe in the future, masks are not going to be worn just because people really are objecting to it for some ideological reason. And so I actually think that we are less prepared for the next pandemic. I actually think our public health infrastructure is decimated even more than it was before we started COVID. And whereas public health was the sleepy backwaters that people didn't think about before, now a good portion of this country think about it in a really negative light. And I am not certain how we're going to get it back to rebuild, but also to even get back to where we were at the beginning of this pandemic.
I want to ask you a personal question. As we think about a more perfect union, I want to tell people, I've read your story. You and your parents were immigrants to this country. You came here under very tough circumstances, very little money in your dad's pocket. And I think lived experience and sharing it can be very powerful. And I would love our audience to know a little bit, a snapshot of how your lived experience made you choose public health as an avocation and a lifetime commitment.
Well, I appreciate your asking this, Steve, and I enjoyed our conversation before about Lifelines, the book that I published that wasn't meant to be a memoir. It was actually meant to be a celebration of public health, and especially the work that we did in Baltimore, but ended up becoming about, in part, my life story, because in a sense, it also illustrates what public health can do. So my parents and I immigrated to the US from China just before I turned 8. And my parents, despite working multiple jobs, my father delivered newspapers, my mother cleaned hotel rooms while she was studying to be a teacher, we still had trouble making ends meet. And there were times when we experienced homelessness. We depended on food stamps. I went to public school throughout. We depended on Medicaid and Children's Health Insurance Program. And for us, those social safety net programs, they were not some kind of entitlement. My parents always made it clear that this is what we needed to do for the time being in order to get our footing. And as a result, my little sister and I have been able to fulfill our own wildest dreams, and I've been able to become a doctor to be able to serve the communities of individuals that in the places that I came from. And I guess I understand so much of public health as being something that can level the playing field of inequality. Because in my city here in Baltimore, for example, we have kids that are born in one neighborhood whose life expectancy is 85 years. But just a few miles away, another child born today can expect to live just 65 years. And it's these social determinants of health that are not just about the health care that you receive. It's also about the educational opportunities you have access to. It's also about the other conditions in your life and the food and the other resources that you have. And so public health can help to level that playing field so that the opposite of health, or so that our children do not have to grow up in a world where they have to experience poor health.
You know, one of the things I really admired about you both during the early start of COVID and during the Trump administration, but also during the Biden administration, is, to the best of my knowledge, you're very apolitical when you talk about these issues. You applauded some things Trump did. You really condemned and criticized some things. And you've been on both sides. I remember when you said, 100 million people in 100 days is not enough, not big enough. This is easily doable. Why? I mean, so you've written critiques in your newsletter in the Washington Post of why this administration's ambition and horizon on these issues should be higher. I'd love to know, in your sober way, what should those policymakers in this town be thinking of right now? What should the Biden administration be doing that it's not doing?
Well, I appreciate the question, and I think that I'm going to reflect on something that Dr. Boris Lushniak, now the Dean of the University of Maryland School of Public Health and former Acting Surgeon General, likes to say, which is that we in public health should aim to be political, but not partisan. As in, we have to understand politics, because doing policy work and working in the sphere where many public health officials are appointees of mayors and governors and other elected leaders, we have to understand how to navigate politics. And so actually one of my critiques of the Biden administration is that they keep on saying, follow the science, when actually the questions that are often there are not just about science. Yes, of course, science is important. Yes, of course, we need to follow the evidence. But for example, in the conversation about boosters, we've seen that you can have the exact same set of data, but different people will interpret it in different ways. And actually, so much of public health is also about values. And the decision at the end of the day should be made by our top elected officials in consultation with scientists, making sure that we are following the science. But that concept of follow the science has been distorted, I think, in the Biden administration to mean only listening to certain scientific agencies at the expense of having a broader stakeholder engagement. And then as a result, you violate one of the core tenets of public health, which is that public health depends on public trust. If you cannot win over hearts and minds, you have lost the day. Just having perfect science is not enough. But But to your broader question, though, about what more can be done, I think very practically, the one thing that I would love to see the Biden administration do is to scale up testing. We need to get to the point that other countries have gotten to, which is UK, for example, has rapid tests available to everyone who wants them. They'll distribute them free to all families twice a week if they want to. There are other countries too, Singapore, Japan, making testing ubiquitous and vending machines. Many other countries, it's the norm to get tested right before you go to a friend's party or a potluck, because that's something that's important to do as we learn to live with COVID. I think the Biden team has done an outstanding job when it comes to vaccine distribution. I would like for them to apply that same level of urgency and the mechanisms, their operational expertise when it comes to making testing available. Ultimately, at the end of the day, though, we in public health have to continue, I believe, to understand the politics and policies, but make sure that we are not partisan in the work that we do.
Thank you. So powerful. Finally, is trick-or-treating? Trick-or-treating is all you're wearing Halloween orange. Is it too early, or do you think it's safe enough?
Well, I plan on going trick-or-treating this weekend. My 4-year-old is really excited about going, especially because we couldn't go last year.
What's your 4-year-old's character?
And so he is going to be Winnie the Pooh. He's dressing his little sister up as Piglet, being outdoors, trick-or-treating, going to outdoor scavenger hunts. We're having a bonfire, an outdoor movie night. All those are really safe things to do. I would avoid indoor gatherings when there are unvaccinated children for the time being. But I think this is a very different year compared to last year because of vaccines and because we know so much better about how we can best protect ourselves and our loved ones.
I wish I had been Winnie the Pooh as a child. I went as Captain Nemo, and maybe that's the problem. But listen, thank you so much, Dr. Leana Wen, former Health Commissioner of Baltimore, Professor of Health Policy and Management at George Washington University, and author, of course, of a book that I just think is so powerful, Lifelines, A Doctor's Journey in the Fight for Public Health. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Steve.
Joining me now is John Bolton, former National Security Advisor to President Trump and U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. He, as you can imagine, has plenty to say about the current administration's efforts on the foreign policy front, from the competition with Russia and China to the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan. Ambassador Bolton, it's a real pleasure to have you with us today. Look, we're bringing lots of different voices into this 3-day festival, if you will, of ideas and people thinking about, how do we get the aspiration set as we look forward for a more perfect union for the United States of America and what we should be thinking about. And you've always been unapologetic in sort of talking about an agenda for the United States, its security and place in the world. And I would love to give our audience an understanding of, what is your dashboard? What do you think the biggest priorities are for this country right now that we have to get right as we look at our future?
Well, I think it's important over the long term not to have the U.S. focus on abstract ideological goals. I think you have to look at the concrete reality of protecting America and its people, their interests around the world, and to do that in the most effective way through alliances where possible and without them if necessary. And I think we have to recognize in the remainder of the century, we face a wide variety of challenges from the strategic level, most importantly, the question of China, but also Russia, and at the more immediate tactical level, the continuing threat of international terrorism, the continuing grave risk of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, especially in North Korea and Iran. And a host of other risks as well. I think the world has become more complicated in the post-Cold War period and in the post-Cold War period. And I think we can expect that for the rest of the century. There's no rest for the weary here when it comes to protecting American interests.
You have written that President Biden will be explaining why America is once again more vulnerable to terrorism after the departure from Afghanistan. You've also recently written that we should get rid of the Shanghai Communique, that we should reduce this obscurity and lack of clarity around Taiwan's status and rope it into a regional security arrangement, a genuine security arrangement with Japan, the United States, and other powers in the Indo-Pacific. I guess my question is, critics of your views on this would say John Bolton wants to do it all. That terrorism and over-responding to terrorism in the past helped us take the eye off the ball on China. My question to you is there any concern you have that we have to do a better job of establishing strategic priorities and that doing it all is tough, or are your critics right that John Bolton wants to do it all?
I think the United States can handle more than one strategic priority. In fact, I don't think it's not only possible we can do that, it's critical that we can. It's certainly the highest priority to focus on the threat of China. I consider it existential in this century, not just for the United States, but for the West as a whole. But that doesn't mean you can disregard other threats. And Afghanistan and the broader Middle East are excellent examples of that. As the Biden administration has withdrawn from Afghanistan and clearly trying to downplay the priority of the Middle East as a region, ostensibly to focus on China, China is increasing its efforts to extend its influence in precisely the region the Biden administration has turned away from. The world's a big and complex place. We are a big and capable country. And I don't think there's any lack of capacity for the United States to do that, where there has been over certainly the Obama, Trump, and now I think the Biden administration's a lack of leadership in both parties to explain to the American people that if they want to continue the kind of life, the kind of society we enjoy here, there has to be active involvement across the globe in order to protect the interest on which that society rests.
Thank you for that. Another thing that interests me is the president you served as national security advisor, President Trump, and with whom you have significant disagreements. Your book was a tour de force of some of those disagreements and laying out what you thought was the important course for the United States. But when you sort of look at this question, that President Trump really did flirt, in my view, with a kind of neo-isolationism, a kind of withdrawal, contracting from a lot of parts of the world, maybe not everything, but significantly. And if you read polls, a lot of Americans, particularly those that served in the military, do feel a fatigue, if you will, from a lot of America's engagement. They sort of felt like they fought the Cold War and China won. I'm just interested in how you turn that around. If there are huge numbers of Americans that are really ambivalent about American engagement and paying what needs to be paid for America to continue to be the security guarantor in the places, I'm just interested, you ran for president of the United States. What do we need to do, or what do you think we need to do to reconnect with Americans on why that task is so important to their bottom line?
Well, I think leadership has to believe that the posture American takes in the world is directly related to the strength of our economy and the viability of our society here. They really are two sides of the same coin. And yet, for far too long, we have not had presidents who have either understood the connection or been willing to make the case. Let's just take Afghanistan as an example. People relied on polls for years that said people want to get out of Afghanistan, end the endless wars. Not surprising when neither Obama nor Trump were defending the deployment of American forces in Afghanistan as an insurance policy. And yet, in the days when the American people watched a national humiliation on television, in the withdrawal from Afghanistan, their views became better informed. And polls now show that the American people think they are less secure after the withdrawal from Afghanistan than they were before. And they're absolutely right. This really cries out for political leaders who are willing to be straightforward with their voting public. And I think if you make the case effectively, the fatigue will fall away when people see that their way of life is under challenge, as I think it clearly is from China and the continuing threat of proliferation and terrorism. They're going to take steps necessary to protect themselves.
Let me ask you another question, because one of the themes we've been looking at is our digital future, digital promise, digital fragility, what are the threats out there? And as a preamble to this, I was recently in Estonia at the Leonard Meri conference, And this was a group of national security and intelligence officials from throughout Europe, but also the Balkans. And as we were doing this, the Russians were building about 200,000 troops for war game exercises just across the border. You had Belarus at the same time has weaponized migration and dropped a lot of people on the border of Lithuania. And you see what some players are doing in hybrid conflict, which is disinformation and, digital destabilization, malware in financial systems and energy grids. And I just wonder how well America is positioned to deal with hybrid conflict. When we used to think about military issues like you and I have been discussing, you know what deterrence looks like. You know what credibility looks like. How does all this terminology work in the coming age of conflict, which is going to be hybrid and it's going to be digital? I just want to know what John Bolton's playbook is in that world.
Well, I think we have a long way to go to catch up with what some of our adversaries like China and Russia have done and already engaged in what, in my view, is an assault on the Constitution. I think that's what Russia's efforts to interfere in the 2016 election were. I think we've seen China engaged in influence operations digitally and otherwise that actually put the Russian effort in the shade. The Chinese effort is so large. So what's happening, and I think it's underway, is the American people have seen the scales fall from their eyes about information technology and the internet. It's not the Garden of Eden. It's just like the rest of the world. There's enormous good there, and there's enormous risk and danger there too. This is the cyberspace is a domain like every other human domain. It has its pluses and its minuses, and it can be peaceful, but it has. We're facing adversaries that have turned it into a domain of war in many respects, and we have to be ready for that. It requires education of the population. We're all learning. As I say, I think we're behind at the moment, but I think we've become more aware, and I think we need the offensive and defensive capability that we're building now. We need to build it faster and bigger, but at least we've stopped we've changed the view that everything's fine and we don't have anything to worry about. That's a major step forward.
Do you think, Ambassador, we are delivering costs to those perpetrators of things like the SolarWinds attack, of those weaponizing? I mean, those players in the hybrid warfare game where, I sort of feel like sometimes the United States and its allies are sort of like the British that are well organized and standing out in the field. And some of these folks engaging in hybrid, they're like what, we American revolutionaries used to be in the forest, fighting us in very untraditional ways. And we're like going, wait, they can't do that. Are we delivering costs to them for what they're doing?
Not adequately yet, but I do think, and I take some pride in this from my time in the Trump administration in 2018, where we changed the rules of engagement for offensive cyber warfare, and I think put the Russians on their heels in 2018. Now that's one skirmish in a long conflict. I think that, as I say, cyberspace is a domain like any other human domain, and deterrence works there as well as it does on any other battlefield. And I think our adversaries, and I think primarily of China and Russia, but also of North Korea and others, need to know that when they attack us, whether it's in the government space or the private sector, that they're going to pay costs that far exceed any damage they can inflict on us. And once that realization takes hold, once we have that capacity, hopefully deterrence will prevent them from engaging in those offensive activities to begin with.
Let me ask one last question. You write, and you mention French Ambassador Philippe Etienne, who was then National Security Advisor to President Macron, in your book several times, so you know him well. In the first time in French-American relations, our first ally, the French Ambassador to the United States was recalled after this move for the Australians, the British, and the United States to do a deal around the sale of nuclear submarines to Australia. And there's one thing, the substantive anger about that, because the French had the contract. The other side was how it was handled. And the French said they were lied to. They were stabbed in the back, even on Bastille Day, in an encounter between their Secretary of State and our Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken. I just love that, decision-making and stuff, how it rolls out. And maybe there's one issue about who should make those nuclear subs and what's involved. But the other issue is trust in a real vital relationship. Do you believe we sent the signal that France doesn't matter as much to us anymore?
Well, it's what happens when you put Republicans in charge of foreign policy. I mean, this is something that I'm quite surprised at, because the Biden campaign in 2020 was to restore competency in international affairs. And it just shows how hard it can be in difficult circumstances. I believe in the NATO alliance. I believe in our alliance with France. I don't think there was any diplomacy, frankly, that was going to overcome losing what has been reported as an $80 billion contract with the Australians. So there come a time when everybody has to pick themselves up, dust themselves off, and say, okay, let's get serious again. Hopefully that's what we're doing right now.
Well, John Bolton, former United Nations ambassador, also former National Security Advisor of the United States, and author of The Room Where It Happened. Great book. It's a great tutorial on national security decision-making during the Trump era and before. I mean, it's a great history of many things that Ambassador Bolton has been involved with. Thanks so much for joining us today on this forum, A More Perfect Union. We really appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
And now we're going to have a mini session on education. And as you know, education has been one of the major tracks in the last 3 days of our sessions on A More Perfect Union. Education is one of the sectors most disrupted by the pandemic. My next guest, Randi Weingarten, is president of the 1.7 million member American Federation of Teachers. As you can imagine, her organization has been especially busy during this pandemic, and it's always busy. Randi, thanks so much for joining us. Look, I want to start with the news of the day. The Build Back Better plan looks like it got some scaffolding and framing. There's still a lot of skirmishes. Yeah. We don't know how it'll all come in. But one of the planks of it is universal pre-K paid for. I'm interested in how big a deal that is. What's the context for it? And what are you happy about the bill? What are you unhappy about the bill? I mean, I know, and I know we're not there yet, but just, at this point in the game.
So let's just say that these two bills have to be taken together. One is a more traditional bricks and mortar infrastructure bill that, frankly, moderates, Republicans and Democrats have said that they've been for infrastructure forever, and Trump couldn't get it done. And you had 60 some odd votes, 68 votes in the Senate for it. And that goes from repairing bridges and roads to getting lead out of the water and getting internet and wiring to rural areas that don't have it. So that bill is sitting there, and that's a big jobs bill. And now this second bill, it kind of takes in many of the others, not all of the others, but many other foundations for a new economy, one being education. We know through brain research that when you can actually educate 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds and give them pre-K and give them 3K, you're going to give them a healthier start in life, because that's when our brains are so supple. And this then says, let's do that for all kids, not just for rich or middle class kids. Childcare, so that families are not paying more than 7% of their income for childcare. We saw this in the pandemic, that when schools and other things were closed, how do frontline workers actually go to work in person? We need to make sure that childcare is affordable. We also need to make sure that elder care is affordable, and that's part of this bill too. We also need to make sure that climate is actually that 1 out of every 3 people in America have gone through a climate changing situation this summer, from the floods and the hurricanes in Louisiana and Florida and Texas, to the fires in California, to the fast floods in New York and New Jersey, which kill people. We have to be serious about changing the climate. And all of these things create jobs and help create better jobs and help give people a better way through or to the American dream and the middle class. So are there things that didn't get in there? Yeah. Are there things that we will fight for another day for, like parental leave? Yes, of course. But if you take these two bills together, it is a transformation like the transformation in the 60s that JFK, that Lyndon Johnson did, first JFK, but then Lyndon Johnson in terms of Medicare and
Sure.
Medicaid and Title I, and the changes that FDR did about Social Security. It is about shifting the economy so that regular folks have a shot at their American dream, paid for by people who have done really, really, really well in the last few years, because the economy is very, very lopsided right now.
So you sound hopeful, and I want to ask a question. I'm so irritated right now that Facebook has renamed itself Meta, because I always ask, I want to ask you a meta question. I don't want Facebook to get any credit for my meta question on this, but you sound hopeful. But one of the issues that I want to ask you in kind of a big frame, and I want to get your thoughts on, schools reopening, the civic dimension of that, building citizens of the future as we think about a more perfect union, but also voting. I mean, I'm interested in solvency of democracy as you see it. You just said you're hopeful about what we just did, but when it comes to the solvency of democracy as we look forward, what are the wobbly parts of that you think we still have to shore up?
I am very concerned, and I don't care what Facebook renames itself. I am very concerned about what has happened in terms of our democracy these last few years, and in terms of what's going on in schools right now as a result of that. Just look at Facebook's algorithms. Facebook's algorithms to get the clicks, to get so for them to make more money, they have to make people more angry. And the more angry people get, the more uncertain people are, particularly in the midst of still dealing with COVID, the more toxic it is. And so if you take the misinformation and disinformation, there is no such thing as a false fact. Either it is a fact or it isn't a fact, or an alternative fact. You take the misinformation and disinformation and you brew it with this kind of anxiety and agita that people have. Mm-hmm. We have a very fragile situation, and you see it in terms of what's happening in our democracy. Our democracy, and look, I'm a social studies teacher. Our democracy is built on a piece of freaking paper, the Constitution of the United States of America. It requires the goodwill of people, regardless of ideology, to say that this way of life is important. And when all of a sudden you have one party deciding that power is more important than that goodwill and of our way of life, of having a voice, of being able to have a vote regardless of who you are, the color of your skin, your sex, we are in a very, very bad danger zone. Now, can we recover? Yes, we can recover. We have to find a way to have those Voting Rights Acts, the John Lewis Act and the Freedom to Vote Act, passed out of the Senate and out of the House of Representatives. But we also have to have people of goodwill all across America say that our way of life is more important than any of our ideology. And so democracy, to me, is the number one issue in our land. And what can we do in terms of educators? One of the things we can do is make sure there's space, age-appropriate way, but make sure there's space in our curriculum so that kids actually have agency, so that kids know what civics means, not just to have like a pledge allegiance to the flag, but to understand what that means. And that also requires looking at the good and the bad of American history, including slavery and its effects, not hide it, not hide what happened on January 6th, and not lie about what happened in the last election.
Randy, you and I have talked in the past about reforms that teachers need to do, that you created Share Our Lessons, I think, or Share My Lesson plan to help teachers understand and kind of revitalize what they're doing. You've talked a bit about standards. From a lot of criticism of the American Federation of Teachers out there is that it's a stagnant pool. I'm just interested, in how you and I have seen this, you and I have talked about this, but I'd love our viewers to hear how, particularly during a pandemic, things have become more dynamic, more nimble. Tell us how you've changed that social contract in teaching between teachers and students and the role they play in society.
Thank you, Steve. So, most of the time, and I'm not saying we're not perfect. Banks are not perfect. Politicians are not perfect. Lawyers are not perfect. Accountants are not perfect. We who represent teachers, we're not perfect. But what has happened is that this idea that teachers joining together to actually make things better is so worrisome to right wing and to people who have power, like hedge funders and whatever. It's worrisome that people are worried that teachers or paraprofessionals or other workers want to get a little piece more of the American dream. So that's why we get slammed by Fox every other minute, because, just like in the last 40, 50 years, why the Chamber of Commerce slammed, unions, because it's a way of equalizing the American dream and creating more of a middle class for workers. Having said that, what we've tried to do in the last couple of years is think about it. Right after the pandemic, all of a sudden teachers had huge autonomy because it was going from in-school learning to doing remote. And we had to basically develop our own platforms. We had to kind of MacGyver as much as we could. We had never been in a situation like that. And you used to hear parents say, oh my God, look at what teachers do. They had a front row seat in what teachers are doing and paras are doing. So this is what we tried to do to help. One, and a lot of people heard this, is that we tried to actually reopen schools more quickly than almost anybody else. We know in-person learning is really important. I sat on the Cuomo Commission. We put a report out in April of 2020 about the steps to reopen schools and how safety was a vehicle to reopen schools. You see how that then gets manipulated in terms of when we say we need to have masks or we need to have physical distancing or good ventilation. Those are ways in, not ways to stop. So that was number one. But number two, in terms of curriculum issues, we started thinking about, well, how do we sum up the 1920 school year? Let's kind of come up with capstone projects. There was no state tests. Let's do that. And then we came up with them and put them on our website. Number three, we revamped the whole Share My Lesson website, made it available to everybody, not just for members. And anyone who's watching, just go to the website. We just did a whole new revamping of all of it. We made it more accessible to everybody. We made it quicker to get to what you want by 1 or 2 clicks instead of 10 clicks. And we put a lot of materials on for parents and for teachers and for kids about learning how to read, also social emotional learning. And those are the things we did, all at the union's cost. And what we've seen is that the number of people who have gone to Share My Lesson have gone up by a couple of 100,000 in the last year or so, because people see its worth and its value. So I think there's almost 1.9 million people that use the Share My Lesson website. But the other things we've done, as you know, turning around West Virginia rural school district.
McDowell County, West Virginia.
Yeah, McDowell. So the bottom line is this. We want every single public school to be a place where parents want to send their kids, where educators want to work, and where kids thrive. And thriving starts with making sure that kids have their mojo back, dealing with the emotional, social issues that have come up as, were there before, but come up in terms of the pandemic, and then also accelerating instruction. So if we can do that and create a welcoming and safe environment, and frankly, I've been since August 1st, 50 schools, 20 states. That's what educators are trying to do right now, even with all the shortages, even with all the protests, even with all of this stuff, eyes on the prize, how we help lift all kids.
Well, listen, I want to tell our audience something. The part of the reason that the Hill did this big 3-day super summit called A More Perfect Union is around a concept that Randy Weingarten and I worked out a few years ago. It's been around for a long time, called civitas. Civitas basically means there's a struggle. There's a struggle. It's not a kumbaya game to think about what the country needs, but you're all going to pull the same way in essentially you care about the country. That's why when we opened this with Senator Joe Manchin the other day, we had Michael Moore, the filmmaker, follow him with a lot of critique and a lot of difference. We actually talked about McDowell County. Today you heard John Bolton on just before Randy Weingarten to show you can have a constructive conversation with people with very, very different perspectives and frames. And I just want to say a personal thanks to Randy Weingarten because she helped me conceive the notion of civitas and what civic engagement means, and also figuring out how you can agree to disagree in a country like this. So Randy Weingarten, President of the American Federation of Teachers, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you for doing what you do. You're incredible.
So continuing our conversation on education's role in creating a more perfect union, earlier I had the opportunity to speak with a great person, Dr. Michael Crowe, president of Arizona State University, one of the most brilliant, innovative educators in this nation. He's a pioneer of what's known as the new American university model, aiming to broaden access to higher education. Let's take a listen.
President Michael Crowe, it's great to be with you, and thank you so much for talking to us about what it takes, from a lot of different perspectives to build a more perfect union. I guess the area I want to get into is what the promise of education used to mean in this country. It used to mean from whatever part of the country you came from, whether you were from a family that didn't have very much, kind of like mine in Salina, Kansas. I hear a little bit like yours. That there were pathways. You could join the military. There was sort of a way to your parents could get an education. You had certain benefits, but it now seems that embedded DNA of how hard work could lead to a prosperous life where you could contribute to a better life for your children has somehow come undone. And universities, rather being pathways to success, are often protecting an elite. In my view, I'd love to know how you look at this and what you're doing at ASU to turn that upside down.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I mean, the question as you pose it is really complicated because the world has certainly changed in the last few decades. It used to be that you could live in your town, you could find a pathway, you could, as you said, join the military, you could learn a trade, you could make things happen. All of those things are still true, but the world and its economic structure and its social structure has become much more shrunk and much more complicated. And there's a requirement for human beings now to take on more types of educational pathways. And so what's happened was that, we didn't take our 19th century college and university model and modernize it. It's still slow and cumbersome and doesn't really scale and is obsessed with selectivity. All of that then means we end up becoming more and more British, which we overthrew to form the country, which I think is a appropriate thing. But what I mean by that is that, we didn't find a way to take our educational institutions, pathways into those institutions and democratize them at scale. And so what used to be a great set of public universities that any kid with a B average could go to and they would cost almost nothing to attend, that's not there anymore. It's become a different kind of thing. So at ASU, we decided to take on this challenge of seeing if we could go back in time and forward in time at the same moment. Could we go back in time to the 1950s, making high levels of aspirational attainment and high levels of egalitarian access possible to the university at the lowest possible cost, but also make the university unbelievably technologically sophisticated and advanced relative to the modern economy? And could you do all of that in the same institution? And the answer is yes, and you can make this happen, but it means we need new models. And we've been trying to prototype this new model.
So I think it's very important. You talk about egalitarian excellence, and I just want to be honest. I think you've said it. I know because I visit ASU frequently. I see it. I see it in your students, the diversity where they come from. But honestly, and I think there are probably other places in the United States, for our viewers and whatnot that are listening to this, that people have stakes in their local colleges and universities and want to be proud of them. But in this notion, I think a lot of people believe there's a zero-sum game between egalitarianism and excellence, that those two don't sit together comfortably in the same sentence, as you just said.
Well,
What's
not only do they think,
Yeah.
not only do they think that, Steve, but so we've grown engineering, just as one example, one of our 16 colleges, from 6,000 students who underperformed 10 years ago to 26,000 students this year who perform at an unbelievable level. And we recently had outside reviewers coming around and said, some people said they can't even review it because they don't know how to review anything that's that big or that diverse or that complicated. And so there's just this cultural proclivity to smallness, this cultural proclivity to narrowness, and this cultural proclivity to the notion that bigness and egalitarian access and academic excellence can't occur in the same place. And I don't know what more technical term to put on that other than it's not true and probably garbage.
Yeah. But I think the way you framed it is really, really important because it stands out as something that many people don't hear and don't know how to, get towards. So I guess my question to you, because, we've known each other for a while. I know you have partnerships with universities and institutions. You're trying to tell the world, come copy us, come study us, come learn us. How is that going? Are you finding the ideas, the models, the prototypes you're developing in inclusive education, in egalitarian excellence, being mimicked by other places?
And the answer is yes. We're seeing more and more of that. We built a University Innovation Alliance with a number of universities that are a part of that. Now, sort of in the halftime of the pandemic or wherever we are in the pandemic, more and more people have said, well, how do you do this? How do you do that? How do you work on things? We've got about 70 universities that are working with our University Design Institute, which is how do you scale? How do you make things happen? But there's still this same old thing, and that is that somehow there's this notion that in the United States, excellence is a function of exclusion. That just can't be the case. It certainly can't be the case at a public university. And so we've got more and more institutions wanting to look at this model, wanting to advance this model, wanting to make a new type of American institution come to life.
Now, I guess two of your missions, I understand, are higher education and sustainability. How has COVID changed the game for you in your two biggest objectives?
So in the mission of the university, sustainability accelerated our innovation rate, made our staff and our faculty even more focused on serving the students and serving the community. So our innovation rate, which is already among the highest in the country, has probably an order of magnitude greater. New ways to teach, new ways to learn, new ways to do research, new ways to become engaged. And so COVID has been a galvanizing thing for us. We never closed for 1 minute. We never laid anyone off. We never furloughed anyone. We didn't reduce any pay. We just buckled on the helmets and moved forward. And then and so we're a different institution as a function of COVID. We've got new ways, new pathways to degrees, new degrees. We built 50 new online degrees. We built new on-campus degrees. And then relative to sustainability, what we've really been doing there is trying to basically build the prototype for the medical center for the planet. And so we have been building a new college of global futures, new school of complexity, a new school of sustainability, a new school for the future of innovation and society. We're launching our new Global Futures Laboratory, which is hundreds of faculty, thousands of students, thousands of projects, and all of that in the middle of the pandemic. We now know that this is not a drill. This is real. The pandemic's nothing but like a 1/1,000,000th of the complexity that we're going to be seeing going forward. It's one of the things that can happen as the world becomes more and more impacted and in a sense made more complex by human interaction. And so it's really galvanized us that we've got to speed up all the things that we're doing to design these kinds of solution pathways.
When he was vice president, I spent a lot of time with Joe Biden, who's now president of the United States. And at that time, we talked about education. We talked about his wife's work, my husband's work on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, educating people that came from all different backgrounds. It was always a fascinating discussion. But one of the things he said to me, he said, Steve, we have a real problem in this country. He was talking about his political party. And I'm not asking you a political question, but he said the Democratic Party was in trouble. The Democratic Party had become a party of snobs. It looked down on people. It was forgetting people. It was leaving them behind. And I look at the university system in some way as whether intentional or not, a lot of people feel demeaned. A lot of people feel left out. I'm just interested. I know ASU is doing it differently, but what advice and counsel do you have to folks who want to turn that equation around?
Well, first, I agree completely with the analysis that the universities have become snobbish. They've gone back to the notion of Plato's academy. There's the philosopher kings and everyone else is an idiot. And that's just never going to work. I mean, that's never going to work in an actual democracy, particularly one of 335 million people. And so the universities have got to look long and hard at their value proposition and their connection to the people. They've got to come up with new languages, new ways of communicating. They've got to take, one of the things that we've done during COVID is We took out the final vestiges of the force fields around us. We went and think of it as sort of just as a story, you know, we dug them all up and did away with them. And so universities, particularly public universities, they've got to stop this barrier that somehow a few can come and they'll become smart and all the rest of the people will somehow bow down to them. This is a terrible, terrible thing in a democracy. And so I'm a first generation college kid, which makes me a little bit chippy from time to time, but I can actually see it. I can sense it. I can feel it that we've gotten way off track in the universities. We're not of as much service as we ought to be to the people. We haven't committed to the, you know, let's just take K-12. If we think K-12 is underperforming in the United States, which it is, well, who's to blame for that? Well, I think we should blame the universities and the colleges. They produce the teachers, the superintendents, and the principals. They produce the curriculum, the learning methods, the learning understanding, all those things. And so let's blame the universities and let's get people to start taking responsibility for the outcome of the country, including these treasured, privileged things called universities. And we don't do that, and we ought to.
So at the highest end of the ranked universities in the country, I look at them and I see enormous endowments protecting them. I sat down with most of these university presidents in the past, and you know, some talk about change here and there and how they're innovative, but the basic model has remained the same. The basic elite and the distance, the exclusion. I love this line you said, at least on one of your tweets. You said we'll be measured by who we include and who we exclude, and there's a lot of exclusion in these other universities. And I guess my question to you is, what is going to take in the country to undermine that model when some of those institutions are so rich and they've become the place where you get a stamp from one of the Ivy League schools and your life is set? And a lot of people feel if you don't have that, then you don't have those opportunities. Yeah.
So our motto, our charter is, we'll base the measurement of the institution's success on who we include and how they succeed, not who we exclude or how many we didn't admit. And that doesn't mean that you don't have admission standards. You do, but if someone doesn't have the admission standards, you help them to meet them. And so where we're headed now, if we continue on this elitist model, is a hugely trifurcated society of the elite educated, the educated, and the less educated, and that will only lead to revolution in the out years. And so it has to be not the case. What we need are universities that are producing fantastic graduates from every family background, every socioeconomic background, every cultural background, with equal opportunity for success. And that's what we've redesigned everything that we're doing. And that means, by the way, having access to, let's say, our School of Earth and Space Exploration, where all the faculty members are scientists in the field. They're running off-Earth missions. We have more than 20 that we're a part of now. And any kid from any background in any family, without limit of numbers, has access to that. You earn your way into that. If you can't earn your way into that, we help you earn your way into that. And if that's what you want to do, we help you. So let's just take engineering again. I'm just using that as an example. We've gone from 6,000 to 26,000, 27,000 engineering students from every family background imaginable. We also took first-year retention from 68% to 90%. And that means then that we figured out how to teach across the spectrum of our society. If we don't figure out how to do this, we're going to be complaining about the Chinese economic monster for a long time. Because we're not going to be able to compete at the level we need to compete, among other things that will be going not in the right direction.
No, it's really fascinating. I interviewed a young woman who's from ASU. I think she's a student, and she was working on a joint mission on the Mars probe that the UAE was doing in a joint project with ASU. Right. And one, it's female from the Arab world and others. But I kind of know that you're a mixing pot. You've brought in refugees that you've done. Right. So I guess the question is, knowing these institutions, and I'm just going to be honest, you say that I think you've produced 5 times the graduates and so many different things, but you really haven't increased the number of faculty. That the productivity of the university has increased dramatically. So you've made it more efficient in many ways. My question is, how did you seduce the faculty to go along with that? Because I think there's a lot of tension sometimes when the universities are trying to change mission and trying to kind of talk the faculty into changing the way in which they interact with the primary mission, which is education.
Yeah, so we seduced the faculty or convinced the faculty to go in the direction of buying this new model by empowering them to be designers of their own intellectual future. So we allowed 85 units to be eliminated, 35 new schools to be built that are all transdisciplinary, so they became empowered. And then we said, our mission is not us. Our mission is the success of all these students coming from the breadth of all of our families and the success of the communities that we're measured in. We're not going to measure the success of the university based on, we beat Stanford in football last week. Well, that's fun, but that's not the measurement of our success. The measurement of our success is the success of our community. And it turns out that lots of faculty, when that's put on the table, that's what they want to do. They want to be a part of that. And that's what we've been able to successfully do here.
A lot of money that pumps into the universities in the country comes from like the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, not the Department of Education, although it's probably involved in some way. But I'd be interested if you took off your educator's hat and put on a policymaker's hat, and you were to give guidance and say, if you really wanted to use the leverage you have to kind of get universities off of an inertia track and onto a track of being innovative, and again, getting back to that core cause of how do we produce highly educated, richly experienced, engaged citizens who believe in and want to kind of build this nation further from where it's at now. I just love to hear, just kind of finally from you, what advice this town needs.
Yeah, so a couple of things. So one, we should start holding people accountable. So if there's schools that are failing, they shouldn't be benefiting from federal financial aid or federal resources. If there are schools that can't innovate and graduate across the spectrum, then why give them the resources? And the resources come through the students. The other thing that Washington needs to do a little bit is stop thinking that you can solve the whole problem with macro level policy maneuvers. What we need is innovation in a sector that's not particularly innovative, and that means stimulating innovative outcomes. Using exemplars, building new models, making new things happen. We've got to move past the notion that somehow your life is set based on the school you get admitted to. And so we've got to stop measuring inputs and start measuring outputs. We measure too many inputs. Most of the rankings and so forth are based on inputs. And so what we need is accountability. We need measurements of investment return. We don't have any of that at the level that we should. We need to break down the barriers of cooperation between the private sector and the universities, and we need to make certain that there are ways in which we stop using these old notions of what we call the deficit model of thinking. So even the government has a deficit model of thinking. They think, well, you don't show up to class, or you didn't do this, or you didn't do that, so you can't get financial aid. We need an abundance model. That is, we don't assume what the people don't know or can't do, but we assume that people are powerful things. The human brain is a powerful thing. Educational success is a powerful thing, and we need people to be driven towards that by resources and recognition.
Well, I'll just say to our audience, the disruptions, the constructive disruptions that I've seen Michael Crowe and his colleagues do in education over these many years has been really astounding. And I look forward to the day, again, thinking about a more perfect union, when ASU looks less fantastic when compared to the other colleges, that a lot of the others look sort of like it. I think that would be, a real stamp of success when everyone else is copying your level of disruption and impact. So Dr. Michael Crowe, president of Arizona State University, thank you so much for sharing some of this story with us.
All right. Thanks, Steve. Nice to see you.
My final guest today began his career as an elementary school teacher. After 2 decades as a public school educator, he served as Commissioner of Education in Connecticut. Today, he's the highest-ranking education official in the land. I want to really give a big welcome to Secretary of Education Miguel Cardona. Ms. Secretary, thank you so much for joining us. Look, I just want to start with the news of the day. I mean, there seems to be a framework deal, and I know there's a lot of political skirmishing still going on, but I don't want to get into that. But it looks like universal pre-K made the cut in the framework arrangement. You tweeted about that today. Tell us what the implications of this are. Help us understand the context of how big a deal this is.
It's a huge deal. First of all, I'm glad to be here with you. But, I've been in education, as you said, for over 2 decades. And this is more significant than anything as an educator that I've experienced. And I'm fortunate to serve as secretary during this time. It is transformational. It's really more than just different strategies to help schools. It's transformational in understanding that we need to do more, that 3 and 4-year-olds are going to have a strong foundation on which to build in their schools. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the disparities in education that have permeated district, states, accountability data, and we have an opportunity now to really address that. So it's significant. I'm pleased with where we're going to be going. I'm excited about the fact that universal pre-kindergarten is there, and I know that the investment there is there's a great return on investment. For every dollar spent in pre-K, you get $3 to $7 of a return. So it's good for our country. But as an educator, as a teacher, I'm excited that early childhood education is getting the support that it needs for our country to move forward.
Well, Secretary Cardona, I want to ask you what is perhaps an unfair question, because I know you can't fix all problems, but we have to face the fact that America is divided today, and those divisions are, it's almost like there are two countries sometimes, living right next to each other. And, many, a century ago, longer than that, public education was the platform by which, Americans were brought together, civics were taught, you sewed the nation together. I'm just wondering whether or not something universal pre-K and the role that, you have, and as you kind of deal with helping to set a new horizon for what we should hope for in education, gives us an opportunity to deal with some of this toxicity and create a new generation of people who are actually pulling together rather than pulling apart.
It will. It will. I'm confident it will. Listen, we're one America. We're one. I'm not Secretary of Education for Democrat states only. I'm Secretary of Education for all students across the country, and their success matters to me. And I want to make sure that I'm supportive and working with every state, even if on certain issues they don't agree with the movement, with the recommendations we make. Education is a unifier. Education is a unifier, and we can get past this pandemic, but also the division that plagued our country. And I know the president has said, we're going to focus on democracy and we're going to unite our country. And I know education has a major role there, and I'm looking forward to continuing the work to make sure that we come across stronger as a country and united as we are.
You are renowned for what you did in Connecticut. You're renowned for, expanding what education meant to people with English as a first secondary language, with folks with disabilities, but also expanding graduation rates broadly. And I'm just interested in to what degree the role you have now has benefited from what you were able to do in Connecticut. How those purviews are different, what you'd like to have more ability to do as Secretary of Education, because I think everybody looks at you as all powerful, but I know there's a lot of limits on what you can do. I'm just interested in, what are the microcosms that you saw in Connecticut that you can expand and help replicate nationwide?
Well, first of all, I had a great team in Connecticut. I have a great team here. I served with a governor that really understood the importance of education and was bold in strategies. And let me tell you, President Biden's leadership around education is impressive. From day one, he made it very clear that for our country to move ahead, we need to focus on education. So some of those strategies that we know worked during the pandemic and even before the pandemic, like being honest about our need to address achievement disparities, about improving access to college and better pathways, and evolving our high schools to make sure that career and college pathways exist, that we're having those conversations, that we're providing access to technology to students boldly, and we're making sure we're working in a collaborative fashion. I often use the word intentional collaboration. We're going to go further if we can work well with people, even people that don't agree with us. That worked in Connecticut when we talked about strategies to improve our high schools. That worked in Connecticut when we talked about reopening schools at the height of the pandemic. And it's going to work at the national level as we're talking about building back better and making sure our system is better than the one that we had in March 2020. Our students suffered a lot, and it's time for us to step up together and make sure that we're doing what we need to do to raise the bar across the country.
I am interested. I'm glad you mentioned sort of, community colleges and other dimensions in the educational picture. And I think what's interesting is, when I kind of look at education out there, and we're talking about, to certain degrees, a bias about, young children and, starting out there, but you're seeing more and more a move to lifelong education and beginning to look at, this broad question of going back, being retrained maybe we need a new credentialing network. Maybe, 4-year liberal arts degrees aren't the answer to a lot of what we need in terms of the American workforce and opportunity. And I know that's a big question, but I think what you implant with people at an early age in terms of expectations of continuity of experience in education is important. Are those on your dashboard? How do you feel about the dimensions of credentialing and whether or not we need to shake up the system a little bit to embrace something that's a little more nimble?
Not only are they on my dashboard, as a high school student that studied automotive technology, pardon the pun, it's a priority. We recognize, I think we've done a disservice when we have this 4-year college or bust mentality in our high schools. We need to be more open about the realities out there, the workforce needs, and we need to connect that earlier with our schools. We need to remove whatever barriers exist between our workforce, our 2-year colleges, our 4-year colleges, and our K-12 systems. And at the Department of Education, we're going to do that. We're going to make sure that the Deputy Secretary for pre-K-12 instruction is working very closely with our higher education undersecretary to make sure there's a very clear through line. I was a first-generation college student, and for me, having clarity earlier would have been much more helpful. And our students across the country need to know what options exist. And we need to understand that, the manufacturing world of today is different than our grandfather's manufacturing. That I recently traveled with the First Lady of the United States to, it's called the Arturo Velázquez Institute in Chicago. And it was a community college that connected to the high schools, but also connected to the workforce. And I walked into 2 different programs. One of them was an aquaponics program, right? So urban farming was the topic that they were developing skills to do. And these students were not only learning about aquaponics, but how to set up their own business to develop this. And that's a growing industry. And our community colleges are great resources for that. Then I stepped into another part of the school that had an electrical lab. So students were getting their credentials to become electricians. And they were getting jobs right when they were leaving, 6-figure jobs in the electric business, in the electric field, without debt. So we need to do a better job informing our students of what options exist and letting them know that you can start in one path and down the road you can change. Or if you get your electrical certificate, you may want to go back to a 4-year college to get a business degree and start your own business. There's tremendous potential out there. We have a lot of opportunity to make sure our families know what's available and evolve our high schools to meet the students' needs and to meet the workforce needs that exist out there today.
Mr. Secretary, just finally, I did an event one time a few years ago, and I had Randy Weingarten, the American Federation of Teachers, and a guy named Chester Finn, who used to be Assistant Secretary of Education and was a very big advocate of charter schools. And I asked them to get out of each other's, out of their seats and to trade places and to argue the best merits of each other's positions. It was a really interesting discussion. It was very respectful. It was very thoughtful, and I think a lot of people in the audience were surprised at hearing that respect and then back and forth. And they didn't agree on everything, clearly. But I think there's a lot of people that look at this as a binary choice and, between one type of school and the other. And I'm just interested in whether, we are learning, from charter schools that were supposed to be R&D labs for broad public school, and public school beginning to try to learn from that, begin innovating, dealing with all students. How is that going in that side from your perspective? And I know you have limited authority in that because school boards are still local. But I'm just interested in whether we're getting to a place where we're getting a healthier public school system in the eyes of the public, and we're also understanding charter schools can be very helpful, but they're not everything.
Right. I think we are. I see excellence in schools, whether they're neighborhood schools or charter schools. I've seen some excellent charter schools, but I've also seen schools that struggle, right? Either way. To me, good schools put students at the center, are innovative, and focus on good pedagogy and connecting students. And don't give up on students, and make sure that they're meeting all students' needs, including our students with disabilities and our students that are learning English as a second language. We're at a point in our country's history where we're as close as ever to a reset button in education. So we need the best innovation now. We don't want to go back to the system that we had in March 2020, because that system, it was almost predictable based on race and place where you might end up. We can do better, and we need innovation at all levels, not only in the classroom. We need it at the principal level, the superintendents, board members. Board members play a critical role in this next phase of education. So we need innovative thinkers at all levels to make sure that our students are getting a product that's better than it ever was before. Again, they've waited for a year and a half of disruption. It's our time to bring them back better, focus on social emotional well-being, on career pathways, and making sure that every child truly has an opportunity to achieve at high levels.
Well, Mr. Secretary, those are very powerful words. I want to remind that audience, he just said we are closer than ever to being at a reset in education where race and place aren't the determinants that matter most. Very powerful. I heard very carefully what you said. I would love to have you back someday so we could discuss this more. But Secretary Miguel Cardona, Secretary of Education, thank you so much for your time and your candor today.
Take care, Steve. Thank you.
That brings us to the end of our mammoth multi-day event of ideas, politics, and people. Everybody in pursuit of their own version of what they think it will take to get us to a more perfect union. A really big thank you to Microsoft and Southern Company and for their support, for trusting us with this important topic and supporting it, and a deep appreciation to all of you who tuned in for these 3 days of conversations. For any of you who missed any of these sessions, head over to our website, thehill.com/events. to get caught up. It's all going to be there. I'm Steve Clemens. Thanks for joining us. Be well.